3 years ago, I bought a homestead in the backwoods of Quebec with the goal of managing the land to support as much wildlife as possible. From digging ponds to sowing wildflower meadows and setting up nest boxes, this is everything that happened in year 3 on the Wildlife Homestead. Before getting into year 3, let's quickly recap the first 2 years. When we moved onto this 30-acre property, I had a simple goal for year 1: figure out what's already living here. It's really tempting to start projects right away, especially when you know there's some areas that can easily be improved. But putting as much time as I could into observation would help me better understand the wildlife and the different habitats, as well as give me a clearer direction for upcoming years. Spending hours exploring the land and checking new species off of my list was definitely some of my fondest memories from the first year. Throughout 2023, I was able to observe 109 bird species. Setting up trail cameras helped me record a couple dozen mammal species, and not to mention hundreds of other animals, plants, and fungi that I saw while walking the property. My goal for year 1 was successful. I now had a baseline of the plants and animals that were here, and I felt comfortable starting projects to try to attract even more species. I'll go over a lot of these projects in more detail as we get into year 3, but to kick off year 2, I started by thinning trees in the planted pine stand. I wanted to convert it from a monoculture tree farm to a diverse, multi-layered habitat. I girdled some of the trees to create dead standing wood for insects and woodpeckers. In one section of the pine stand, I cleared the thick layer of needles and seeded a native wildflower meadow. I built a few nest boxes for the birds, and we dug a vernal pond for spring breeding amphibians to add to our 2 existing ponds. In some of our open areas, I put in 1,000 native wildflower plugs to diversify and expand the meadows. All the while, I was slowly adding more species to my list. I was able to see 10 new bird species for the property in 2024, bringing our 2-year total to 119. Every season had its ups and downs, but with each month that passed, I was learning more about the wildlife that lived here. I was excited to build on this momentum from the previous 2 years, and in early winter, we officially began year 3 on the Wildlife Homestead. When we first moved here, we arrived in late November. So every year after we get our first few snowfalls, it not only signifies the end of the growing season, but also the beginning of another year on the Wildlife Homestead. I think the winter is highly underrated. On the surface, the landscape might seem lifeless, and if you're comparing it to the summer months, you'll probably be disappointed. But the more you look, the more you realize there's wildlife all around. And because of the tracks in the snow and less vegetation, it can actually be one of the easiest times to find animals. Something I look forward to every December is watching the wildlife at my feeding stations again. I only run feeders during the winter and a little bit into the spring and fall migration. In the first year, I did experiment with a few feeders during the summer, but there's so much natural food available that we rarely have any visitors. For the winter food, I like to put out mostly sunflower seeds and peanuts, but I also spread cracked corn for snow buntings. I have a few hanging feeders and some logs where I put real beef suet. In the winter, many songbirds will strip the fat off of moose and deer carcasses, so the beef suet is a good substitute for that. Every year, I'll also make homemade batches of suet from a recipe I got in an old birding book. Basically, everything that lives on or visits the homestead in the winter eats it. One of my favorite ways to use it is to drill holes into dead trees and spread the homemade suet inside. I initially did this for woodpeckers and nuthatches, but what I found out is this is hands down the best way to observe brown creepers. Brown creepers are usually scaling up trees, meticulously searching the cracks of the bark for any insects. I wouldn't say they're overly difficult to find, but they're quite small and they're always on the move. So to have them sitting still for a few minutes at the suet gave me enough time to really admire their features. I've always found the patterns along their back to be striking. It's no surprise their main defense against predators is camouflage. If a predator were to show up, they could freeze and press their bodies against the trunk of a tree, hiding their white front while their back blends in seamlessly with the bark. Being this close, I was able to see their stiff tails, which they use as a brace when creeping up trees. And this side profile shows one of the main reasons they're able to scale bark so easily: their long, sharp claws. I do enjoy running these bird feeders, mostly because it helps me keep tabs on the different wildlife. But in the winter, it's also nice to have something to occupy your time with when there's a lot of projects you can't do. But one thing I could do at this time was build new nest boxes. There's so many species that rely on cavities for nesting, and building boxes is the quickest way to provide them with that habitat. I try to save all my building projects for the winter, that way I'm not stuck inside the garage during the busiest months of the year. But even though the winter is quieter, there's always something to get distracted by. While I was preparing nest box plans, something caught my eye at the trout pond. This was early in the season before the ice had fully formed on the pond, and I spotted an American mink slipping in and out of the water. At first, I thought it was hunting the last few trout in there, but as I got closer, I realized it was diving beneath the surface to hunt hibernating frogs. I wondered if this mink would spend the winter here, but after reviewing the footage, I understood why it wouldn't. I watched it hunt for just over 30 minutes, and in that time it dove underwater 6 times. 5 of those it came up with a frog. That's a pretty high success rate. Mustelids are notorious hunters, and if it really wanted to, this mink could have probably wiped out a good portion of the pond's frog population in just a day or two. Luckily for the remaining frogs, this was the only day I saw the mink. In an earlier video, I mentioned that it was a good year for frogs in this pond since there were only a handful of trout left, so it's interesting to see how nature doesn't waste any time balancing things out. That's one of the things I've been fascinated by since moving here, is seeing how populations fluctuate from year to year. Last winter, our biggest jump in numbers was from the evening grosbeaks that went from a dozen the year before to over 200. This winter, our biggest increase was definitely in red squirrels. The last 2 winters, the most we had around our house was around 8, and this winter we had close to 2 dozen. Of those 24, there were 2 persistent squirrels that learned how to escape the cold weather by squeezing through some cracks in the potting shed behind our garage, and they started building a nest. I didn't mind them being in there. We don't use that shed during the winter, and it's mostly just shovels and tools, things that they can't really damage. But they were getting into some landscape fabric and string to make their nest. So I wanted to test out if giving them a dedicated box in there would make them less destructive. I had this hollowed piece of poplar laying around. I just widened the inside a bit, then drilled a 2.5-inch entrance hole. I smoothed it out, put a roof on it, and set it up on a table inside the shed. I filled it with grasses, lichen, and shavings, but wanted something a little warmer. Now, I don't want to name names, but somebody in our house likes to steal and rip socks, so I cut them up and left them outside the box. It took a few days for them to get comfortable with the new setup. After finishing up my peace offering of peanuts, they got started on bringing in the socks. I feel like these 2 squirrels lived in luxury. They had a remarkably consistent schedule that they stuck to all winter. Around sunrise, they'd slowly make their way out of bed. Then it's off to the feeders to stock up for the morning. At lunchtime, they'd usually come back inside to check on the box and play around the shed. They'd go back outside to the feeders for the afternoon. And at sunset, they'd be inside the shed, winding down for the long winter night ahead. By nightfall, they were already tucked away inside the warm bundle of socks. Setting up this box worked really well in deterring them from destroying anything inside the shed. Besides a few pine cones they left behind, I don't think I would have been able to tell that they were in here if I didn't have the cameras. By early April, they stopped using this log altogether as the weather warmed up and likely moved into the forest to find a higher, more secluded site to nest. With the winter slowly moving on, I continued chipping away at building more boxes. I bought and built some nesting trays for mason bees and leafcutter bees. I made a couple more bat boxes. And a new box that I'd be experimenting with were bumblebee houses. I read a few studies that bumblebee boxes can be really hit or miss the first year, so I tried casting a wide net by using different woods, sizes, preservatives, entrance holes, and nest materials. Last year we had some that nested in an old red squirrel box, so I tried filling the bumblebee ones with similar materials. I started with a base of wood shavings, then did a mix of either grasses, hay, or more shavings. And for insulation, we've been collecting some of our rabbit's fur every time she sheds. I also harvested some cattail heads and used the fluffy seed heads as insulation. I numbered each of the boxes so I'll be able to track which design and materials were the most successful. As we were getting closer and closer to spring, I did another round of offloading trail camera footage. I'll admit, it was nice to see so many videos of red foxes. So far we've had one good year and one bad year for foxes, but after seeing all of these clips, I was hopeful we'd get the fox family visiting again. I was also eager to check a new camera that I placed at a pile of suet. I usually only put out a few chunks, but sometimes if we're near the end of winter and I have a lot left, I'll just put all of it out. Early on, chickadees, nuthatches, woodpeckers, blue jays, and Canada jays found the suet. At night, there was an ermine and flying squirrels. And eventually, a fisher came along. It wasn't too sure about it at first, but it got one taste and it couldn't pass up this meal. It started ripping off chunks to cache in the forest. While it was gone hiding the suet, a mouse would show up and frantically eat some before the fisher came back. The last visitors to this pile were common ravens. At first it was only one, but word must have got around quickly because it didn't take long for a handful to show up. It was now late March, and I got the inspiration to build a large nesting tower after reading a book about chimney swifts. Historically, chimney swifts would nest in big hollow trees in our area, but as those became more and more rare, they started to nest in man-made structures like chimneys, barns, and silos. It's gotten to the point where many swifts associate towns with potential nesting sites, so I figured I'd try building them a 12-foot tower beside our garage. I built a mini model of the chimney swift tower that I want to build. Right now it looks like a little chimney swift tower for ants, but all in all it's going to be 12 to 14 feet tall, and I just wanted to make sure that I had my design down perfectly because this is going to be the biggest box that I've ever built here. The bottom's going to be supported by these 4x4 posts. Underneath there's plenty of holes for drainage and ventilation. Like I mentioned, these sides here are going to be about 12 feet tall. The top 2 feet are going to be protected by a predator guard, so nothing can get inside the box. And then on the roof, that's the entrance right there, there's going to be a sun collar around it that faces north. That way there's less sun getting into the box, because apparently that's one of the reasons why some of the nests can fail. And the tower itself will be 3 different layers. The exterior is going to be plywood, followed by this 1.5-inch insulation board. And then since we moved here, I've had a bunch of this tongue and groove just sitting around. And this actually works out really well because there's already these grooves inside that I think the chimney swifts can hold on to. But just in case, I don't know if they're deep enough, I'll make some deeper grooves on the top and the bottom as well, just on the table saw. And that'll give them plenty of options to choose from wherever they want to perch. With the snow almost fully melted, it was crunch time to get the last set of boxes up. There were a couple for northern flickers and a couple for American kestrels, and I finally built one for fishers. A female fisher will use multiple den sites throughout the season to raise her young, which she'll usually have in late winter, so the box had to be warm enough and big enough to fit her and her kits. I built it to be about 3 feet tall, and it had a similar design to the chimney swift tower with insulation boards sandwiched between plywood to keep the temperature stable. I also outlined the entrance with metal plates. Fishers are sexually dimorphic, the males are about twice the size of females, and have been known to raid dens and attack the kits. I'm hoping this entrance size and the metal plates are enough to allow the female to go in and out, but keep the male fisher from forcing his way in. I was cutting it a little close, but I got everything done before my May 1st deadline. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for one of my favorite times of the year. Nothing signifies a spring quite like the emergence of our earliest breeding amphibians. Hundreds of wood frogs travel to reach our ponds, where all the breeding happens in just a few nights. Last year we built a small vernal pond to diversify the water features we have on the property. Our trout pond and forest pond are larger, permanent water bodies, and the vernal pond is shallow and only meant to hold water for a few months. The water in these smaller pools tends to heat up quicker, which means the tadpoles develop and emerge faster than in the colder, deeper ponds. Despite the cold weather, I was happy to see the wood frogs once again return to the vernal pond, and there were a handful of egg masses suspended in the ice. Along with the wood frogs, we had 2 new amphibians breeding in the vernal pond. Now that there's vegetation growing in and around the water, we had spring peepers calling along the edges. And while one of my friends was visiting, we were able to film American toads breeding in the water. My friend also helped me with removing invasive plants behind the trout pond. This invasive Catani aster was growing when we first moved here, and it's been quickly spreading along the whole backside of the dam and a little bit up towards the trout pond. Luckily, most of these branches had pretty shallow roots, so they weren't too bad to pull up, until we got to the main root balls, which were way more anchored in. This is what it looked like after we got it all removed. I was happy to finally get this done. We also found a bunch of landscape fabric, silage plastic, and old soil bags buried here, so it was nice to get all of that out of the ground. We took some of the rocks that were here and made a little micro habitat for insects and snakes. And where there was bare soil, we put in a couple hundred native wildflower plugs. I also seeded the dam with a few dozen grasses and forbs, which were happily eaten by the chipping sparrows. When everything was done, it didn't look too impressive. In the first year, most of these plants are just establishing their roots. But after a few weeks, we were rewarded with some flowers, mostly from the eastern columbines. In a couple of years, I'm hoping this dam will be a dense, diverse pollinator patch. I think after a long, drab winter, there's no better sight than bright spring flowers. Bumblebees are some of the first pollinators to emerge and take advantage of these early blooms. By vibrating their flight muscles, they raise their body temperature high enough to fly on chilly mornings when almost nothing else is active. I was shocked to see that 4 of the 8 bumblebee houses I set up were now active. These are confusing bumblebees, and they have a fairly short breeding season. The queen showed up in the spring, and by midsummer the colony already started to decline. I had numbered each box, and the ones that were occupied were numbers 1, 2, 4, and 7. There weren't any characteristics that were unanimously favored by the bumblebees, but 3 of the 4 successful nests had a 3/4 inch entrance hole, the other one had a 1-inch hole, and 3 of the 4 had rabbit fur as the insulation instead of cattail seed heads. 3 of the 4 occupied boxes were also right beside the newer pine meadow I seeded last year. This area was just rows of planted red pines, and even in the growing season, the understory was pretty bare. So the last 2 years I've done some thinning, some seeding, replanting, and I built some brush piles in here to try to add some diversity and structure to this even-aged monoculture. We'll revisit this meadow a little later in the summer when the plants really get going. But over the winter I did some more thinning in here since there was still a bit too much shade in some parts of the new meadow. I'm not gonna lie, I got completely distracted with building boxes, and I only remembered that I never finished thinning the pines when one of them uprooted in early spring. But this uprooted tree, along with all the deadwood and the brush piles that I built, created the perfect habitat for one of my favorite birds. This tiny little bird is a winter wren. Despite being one of the smallest birds on the homestead, it makes up for its size by being one of the loudest. They have so much character, and usually just seeing or hearing one brings me a lot of joy. But this one really spoiled me when it started building a nest in the roots of the fallen pine. Nesting in uprooted trees is one of the winter wren's specialties. It started by using dead pine needles to create an entrance hole, and afterwards it was scouring the brush piles for nesting material. Honestly, the more I watched the wren build, the more impressed I was with this nest placement. Not only is it really well hidden, but the winter wrens blend in so well with the root ball. Predators, especially smart ones like corvids, will sometimes watch birds going to and from a specific spot, and they're able to deduct that there's a nest nearby. But with this setup, the dangling clumps of mud are always swaying in the wind that unless you're a few feet away or zoomed in like this, it's hard to tell what's wren and what's mud. I watched him build for 3 days, and I was hoping to see him for the next few weeks, but like some other wren species, male winter wrens will build multiple nests. Then when they find a mate, the female will decide which nest to finish and lay eggs in. Sadly, they didn't choose this root ball as their main nest site. But after seeing how easily it attracted them, I wouldn't mind, and I'm sure the wrens wouldn't mind, if I purposefully uprooted a few more trees in the pine stand next year. With the birds now settling in, I was seeing more and more nesting activity. American robins were the first ones to start building their nest. This is where they nested last year, and I was really happy to see they came back to the same spot. It was funny because she didn't start building right away. For 3 days she would show up at all hours, and it looked like she was envisioning exactly where her nest would go, maybe how big it would have to be, or how much grass and mud she'd have to use. A good design needs a good plan, and it's how she was able to go from this to this in just 5 days. As spring went on, I kept my eyes on the trail cameras to see if I could spot any new young. It's about that time when moose calves, deer fawns, and fox kits are all starting to explore the land for the first time. Despite the adult foxes showing up every few days, it was late May and I still hadn't seen any babies. But luckily, by early June, every morning I'd wake up to signs that the kits were here. At first, it was little things like pots being knocked over, tiny droppings, or finding my plant tags chewed up. Eventually, I found a moose foot in our driveway and some bones in the forest, so it seemed like they were coming around more often. I also started to see freshly dug entrances under our shed, so I set up a camera to see what was going on under there. We had a good mix of species, but ultimately it was the foxes that spent the most time under here. To this point, I'd only catch quick looks of the babies as they'd hide in the taller vegetation, so nothing looked out of the ordinary. But that's until I got this video under the shed. Although the back legs were a little muddy, they were clearly different. I've been watching red foxes since I was a kid, and I can't remember ever seeing a wild one with white legs like this. One of the nice things about the foxes having these patterns on their legs is it made it so much easier to identify each one. I tried doing this the first year and I struggled quite a bit because all of their coats were just so similar. This year all I had to do was study the white patterns and give them a nickname that described their pattern. By doing this, I was able to identify 5 different fox kits. The first one has white going halfway up its legs, so I nicknamed it Socks. The second one has a bigger white blotch on its left leg than its right, so that's Lefty. And there's 2 that have white almost up their entire legs, kinda like they're wearing pants. One has a patch of its regular coat on the back of its right leg, and the other has a patch on the front of its left leg. So I named their pattern Back Pocket and Front Pocket. And then there's Waldo. At first glance, I thought he was the only kit that had a typical red fox coat. But in a few clips where he lifts his legs, you're able to see a bit of white on the bottom of his back left paw. Since it's hard to find, I figured Waldo was a fitting nickname. Now these aren't meant to be great names by any means, but they're just meant to describe the pattern so I know when I see a kit if it's one that I've already seen before or if it's a new one. And I was happy to do that because putting in the time to identify each one made every encounter feel more meaningful. There was something special about being able to recognize them, not just how many were around like in previous years, but who they were. Around the meadows, the tree swallows had finally decided on a place to nest. Our property is mostly forested, so we're limited with how many tree swallow pairs we can attract, but we managed to get 2 pairs. For the 3rd consecutive year, our tree swallows have had big clutches and all the young fledged successfully. Nearby, eastern bluebirds were also busy feeding their nestlings. The warm sun, countless blooms, ripe fruit, and insects at their peak means that the food is nearly endless. And it couldn't come at a better time, as many species are either raising their offspring, fueling up for the fall migration, or in some cases already preparing food caches for the long winter. That's why I would imagine for wildlife there's both a sigh of relief and a sense of urgency as the abundance of summer arrives. With the hot summer weather moving in, many of the wildflower plugs I planted last year were really taking off. I was curious to see which plants would be growing in the pine meadow. I initially seeded this area with 40 different species, but we had 1,000 or so juncos migrate through and they fed on a lot of it. So it's kind of fun now to find new plants popping up and seeing which species survive the juncos. Early on, I was seeing a lot of the non-natives. Last year I came in and hand-plucked as many of the invasive species as I could, and now it looked like that had very little effect on them. But as the season went on, more of our native species started taking over. The most abundant were the black-eyed Susans. Black-eyed Susans are biennials, meaning they'll typically complete their life cycle in a couple of years. So they tend to dominate a new meadow early on, but as different species establish and fill in the bare soil around them, they can't reseed and they'll slowly fade out. Which is what I expect to see in this pine meadow in a few years. From afar right now, it just looked like a sea of black-eyed Susans. But throughout the season, I was looking at what was growing beneath them, and I found a variety of different species, all of which would play a role in the future of this meadow. One plant that's doing really well is the wild bergamot, which was heavily visited by the bumblebees. Later in the season, there were also asters and goldenrods popping up. The nice thing about these meadows is they're never static. They're always evolving and the species composition changes year to year. So although this new meadow is far from perfect, when I think back to the empty understory under the pine trees, it's nice to now see all this greenery providing habitat for snakes, insects, and arachnids. One of the main reasons I'm trying to add more native grasses and forbs is to increase our insect diversity, specifically our butterflies. Since the homestead is almost all forest, it overwhelmingly favors moth diversity, which I'm definitely not complaining about, especially when some of our moths look like this stunning Columbia silk moth. But when I look around, butterflies here are few and far between, so as I keep adding more native plants, and by giving them enough time to build up their populations, we should see more every year. One species that I've already had success with is white turtlehead. When we moved here and stopped mowing, this really began to take off. And this year we saw our first Baltimore checker spots, which is no surprise since turtlehead is their primary host plant. It's little relationships like this that I'm always thinking about when I'm adding new plants to the property. I've also been trying to put in more flowers for our tiniest bird, the ruby-throated hummingbird. Planting for these hummingbirds is pretty simple. I wanted to choose plants that bloom in early spring when they arrive, and others that continue blooming in succession until they head south in the fall. For our area, the trifecta of hummingbird plants is Eastern Columbine in the spring, Scarlet Bee Balm in the summer, and Cardinal Flower in the fall. The real star is the Scarlet Bee Balm. This stuff blooms for almost 2 months, and I rarely have to stand next to one for more than 10 minutes before a hummingbird comes to visit. All around the homestead, different species were taking full advantage of summer's abundance. I was keeping a close eye on the mason bee and leafcutter bee trays. Earlier in the spring, a few mason bees brought in mud and pollen to create little nesting chambers to lay their eggs. In the summer, I was expecting to see leafcutter bees show up, but what we got instead were lobed mason wasps. Similar to the mason bee, they bring mouthfuls of mud into their nesting chambers, shaping it carefully into a series of cells. After a cell is created, the female lays an egg, but instead of filling it with pollen, she stocks it with something a little bigger: caterpillars. I find it remarkable that they're able to paralyze caterpillars and actually fly with them when they're around the same size or even heavier than they are. Pound for pound, I can't think of many flying animals that can do that. When the egg hatches, the larva will have a handful of protein-packed caterpillars to feed on while they develop, and eventually they'll emerge as a new adult wasp. Except, not all of these cells will produce a lobed mason wasp, because while she's been building, she's also been watched by the cuckoo wasp. This colorful iridescent wasp is a parasitoid. It sneaks into the nests of other species and lays its own eggs inside their cells. When the cuckoo wasp larva hatches, it consumes both the host larva as well as the stored caterpillars. For the cuckoo wasp, timing and stealth are everything. If it gets caught in or around the chamber, the mason wasp will attack. I started paying attention to how long the mason wasp would be away from her nest. When she left to gather mud, she was back within 30 to 90 seconds. But when she went out to hunt caterpillars, she disappeared for 2 to 5 minutes, and once it was almost 10. So it's much safer for the cuckoo wasp to wait for that longer window. But how does it know when to make its move? Well, this one was waiting for a very specific cue. The mason wasp always backs into the nest right before laying an egg. Once she does that and flies off again, the next step in her routine is to go hunt. That's the moment the cuckoo wasp has been waiting for. As soon as the mason leaves, she slips inside to lay her own egg. So in the end, this cell still produced a wasp, just not the one that built it. Now, it might seem like a lot of the nest boxes I set up were successful, but in reality, any nesting season will have its successes and failures. Just to name a few, the kestrels and flickers were checking out the new houses, but were chased off by starlings. My bat boxes caught the interest of some sapsuckers who remodeled them with many little holes. The cliff swallows ended up building their own nest on our house instead of using the artificial ones I bought. But they abandoned it after a pair harassed the female while she was sitting on an egg. The only activity we had the entire year at the big chimney swift tower was a pair of phoebes going in and out. And those same phoebes nested on our garage and had 4 nestlings, one of which didn't make it, and the other 3 likely fell out after the nest broke. Nest failures like this are pretty common, but nobody has it as bad as the ground nesting birds. Just in our area, there's a couple dozen species that are known to raid ground nests. From rodents to mustelids to birds. There's also some larger mammals like raccoons, bears, skunks, foxes, coyotes, and although it's rare, some studies have observed deer taking chicks from songbird nests. Just this spring, I watched a pair of hermit thrushes build 4 nests before they were successful. The first 3 were all raided either during the nest building stage or shortly after laying the first egg. And honestly, I couldn't stop thinking about it because all of these raids happened within a short distance from one another. It made me really curious to find out if it was one animal or multiple animals targeting these thrushes. I've never really done an experiment that focuses on nest predators, but I'm always trying to learn more about the wildlife that lives here, so I started brainstorming ideas. I didn't want to put a trail camera anywhere near a real thrush nest because that could be something that catches a predator's attention and draws it in closer. So what I did instead was I waited for the nesting season to be done in mid-August. That way I wouldn't potentially attract more predators to an area where birds were nesting, and I set up 6 fake nests with quail eggs. For one of the decoys, I used an old robin nest as the cup since their season was done. But for the others, I just made small depressions in the ground with 3 eggs in each. Like I mentioned earlier with the winter wrens, some predators will use the adults going to and from the same area as a visual cue to locate the eggs or the chicks. But since these fake ones won't have any movement around them, I made sure they weren't as well hidden as a real thrush nest. The first clips we got at the fake nests were from a handful of hermit thrushes, both adults and young. I don't know for sure, but this might be the pair that had their nests raided. It's all around the same area, so the odds are good. And I like to think that they had some success after a pretty rough season. After about 36 hours, we had our first fake nest raided. You can see the red squirrel actually found the camera first, which is exactly why I didn't want to put one near a real nest. It came back a few times and took all 3 of the eggs. A raccoon also found the camera first before smelling the nest. I'm sure it would have taken eggs, but this one was after they were all gone, so for nest 1, there was only 1 predator. At the second nest, there was a little bit more variety. The first egg was taken by one of the adult foxes. The second was scooped up by another red squirrel. And the last egg was eaten by one of the baby foxes. This one looks to be Lefty. Then the next day, Lefty was foraging on some blueberries around the third nest and found the quail eggs by complete dumb luck. Nest number 4 had an American mink come right up to the eggs, but surprisingly it didn't take any. A fox also walked right by them. This was the least camouflaged nest, and for some reason it was the only one that was never raided. And finally, nests 5 and 6 had all of their eggs taken by Waldo. So in the end, 3 eggs were untouched, 4 were taken by red squirrels, and 11 by red foxes. And I guess these results make sense. They've been so good at rodent population control throughout the summer, it's understandable they also influence bird populations. I'm not sure if the nest raiding was something the young picked up from their parents, or if it's just an inherent behavior, but this made me realize how far the baby foxes had come. They were now venturing off and searching for their own food and getting more independent with each passing day. This independence tells me that winter isn't too far away. But luckily for the baby foxes, they still have 2 months of beautiful, crisp autumn weather to hone their skills before the snow arrives. The autumn is when our wildflowers really come to life. A lot of the species that I've been seeding and planting are spring and summer blooming plants, mainly because we already have a good diversity of fall flowers. This year, I was excited to see which species would grow beside the vernal pond. After leveling the area last year, I seeded the bare soil with native grasses and forbs. With almost 2 full growing seasons under their belt, a lot of these plants are starting to mature. The dominant species, especially along the dam, were sneezeweed and blue vervain. Dotted around were also great blue lobelias, monkey flowers, cardinal flowers, swamp asters, and native grasses, which were providing food and cover for a number of different species. This was our driest year so far, and unlike last year, the vernal pond actually dried up in early September. Which is still a few weeks later than what I intended, but better late than never. After it dried up, if we got enough rain, it would fill up a few inches, which made it the perfect bathing spot for some of the migrating sparrows. During these dry periods, it was great to have some cup plant growing. Not only is it a good pollinator plant, it provides seeds for birds in the fall, and the stems and leaves form a cup that hold water, where insects and birds can grab a drink. As these mature, they'll hold more water and produce more seeds and blooms, so they'll be a great addition to the vernal pond for many years to come. With it being a drier year, I was a little disappointed with the activity by the small creek that runs through the property. The past 2 years, this has been my favorite camera to check, but since the water was so low, the amount of videos we got was way down. But nonetheless, this is still one of my more reliable spots to see fishers. I knew we'd be seeing a lot more of them at this time of the year because our apple trees were dropping fruit. Although some species are comfortable with coming close to our house to visit our apple trees, others are a bit more shy. So it's become a bit of a yearly tradition to spread some around the property and share the bounty. One thing I've learned by doing this is that fishers love apples. It's one of the main reasons I've been planting more every year. Eventually, we'll have enough trees producing where I won't have to worry about spreading apples. But for now, it's a great way of getting a sneak peek of what's to come. I figured now was as good a time as any to check the fisher box, which I set up right between the creek, the winter suet spot, and where I dumped apples. I know they spend a lot of time in this area, so it felt like the best place to put it. When I checked the camera after 5 months, I saw there were a few mice, birds, and red squirrels that visited. Unfortunately, the fisher never found the box, but a flying squirrel did take a liking to it, so this may turn out to be a large and unnecessarily expensive flying squirrel box. I am looking to set up a second one this winter, and I think I found the perfect spot. Beside our forest pond, we got a video of a female fisher that looks like she was nursing young. She was also inspecting a flying squirrel house that was close by, so putting the second den box somewhere in this area may be my best bet. I'm happy to say I did have my best in-person fisher sighting this year. At the back of our property, we have one tree that has a really nice cavity, and every time I walk past it, I always check to see if something's using it. One afternoon, I was walking the dog here, and when I looked over at the tree, I couldn't see the cavity anymore. All I had on me was my phone, so I zoomed in and saw a fisher sticking its head out. I immediately ran back home to get my better camera, but it was gone by the time I got back. Considering how rare it is to see one, I was a little bummed out I didn't get better footage of the fisher. I know it's not true, but I do get the feeling sometimes that wildlife can sense when I don't have my camera with me. It seems like when all I have is my phone, they'll just hang out and slowly walk around without a care in the world. One day I was going to put out some more apples and salt blocks with my tractor, and a barred owl flew right in front of me at the forest pond. Of course, it was when I didn't have my camera. But this time around, I was able to run back to the house to get my gear, and when I returned, the owl was happily sleeping in the afternoon sun. Eventually, a mixed flock of songbirds spotted the owl and started alarm calling. But it was largely unbothered and quickly went back to sleep. I left it for the rest of the day and returned in the evening to see if it was still there, and it was actually hunting around the forest pond. I saw it perching on the branches of the larger maples, and I found one that would be a great tree for another nest box. I could wedge the box between the main trunk and the thicker branch, and if they use it, the branch could be a good spot for the young to stretch and develop their flight muscles. I decided to go with a more natural box, and I hollowed out a large log. I shaped an entrance hole, put a roof on it, and it's now sitting high in the maple, waiting for the first barred owls to find it. A few days later, I did find the second owl from this pair. And seeing them side by side, I was surprised at how easy it was to tell them apart. The one on the right, which I'm assuming is the female, was lighter and the barring on her face was less pronounced. Whenever I see an owl, it motivates me to build even more houses, so I decided to make 10 for saw-whet owls. I read that some people have had success with grouping 5 to 10 boxes together in a small area. So I chose a little patch of forest and built a footpath through it, which I'm calling my saw-whet owl trail. Then when I set up the boxes, I oriented them so they're all visible from this one trail. This might seem a bit excessive to set up 10 boxes for saw-whets when only one would be used in the year, but we're lacking trees that are both big enough and dead enough for pileated woodpeckers to create these nest sites naturally. So I know that even if we don't get any saw-whets, there's plenty of other species that can benefit from these houses. One of my favorite things to do at the end of the year is to go back and look through all the videos I've taken because there's always little moments that I forget about. In the spring, I was filming cedar waxwings in the apple tree when a flash of blue darted in. I thought it was a bluebird, but it turned out to be a stunning indigo bunting. It was here for maybe 10 seconds and then it was gone. The same went for the Baltimore oriole that showed up at the hummingbird feeder, which was the 124th bird species for the Wildlife Homestead. We actually lost a species off the list because the common redpoll and hoary redpoll are now lumped together as one species. I also checked the trail cameras for the last time and got an interesting look at a moose after it knocked one over. There were a few bulls that passed through during the rut, as well as the female and her young calf, that was now a lot bigger. With their winter coats coming in, the foxes were looking fluffier every day. This made their white legs even more pronounced, so I should be able to recognize them throughout the winter. One of the cameras glitched, but still managed to get a very short 2-second video of one of my favorite mammals, the Canada lynx. So far, we've only had 5 lynx videos over the past 3 years. At this pace, it should only take me about 100 years or so before I'll have enough footage to make a video about them. As year 3 comes to a close, the homestead is a lot quieter. The snow is falling and all the migrating birds are long gone. I have a lot of respect for every animal I see now because they've made the decision to stay and tough out the bitter cold winter. And with winter settling in, all I can do now is think about the new animals and the new stories that next year will bring here on the Wildlife Homestead.